Without that, the Commedia could not have been written. So in that sense, I suppose, the exile was a fortunate fall for Dante.
It was the pleasure of the citizens of Florence to cast me out of her dearest bosom, where I was born and raised to the summit of my life, and where, with their good leave, I desire with all my heart to rest my weary mind and end my allotted span. I have wandered through almost every region in which the tongue of ours extends, a stranger, almost a beggar.
From the Convivio, which means, ironically, the banquet, an incomplete treatise written during exile, Dante speaks of his unresolved longing to return to Florence, a longing that fueled his anguish, but also sparked his imagination. Florence was as present to him as though he still walked its streets, passing from the Via del Corso in his neighborhood, past one of his old schools in the Piazza di Santa Croce, across the Rubicante Bridge, and up the stone stairwell leading to the church of San Miniato al Monte. Florence supplied the topography for the Divine Comedy.
Well, this is it, the steps that lead up to the church of San Miniato. This is the Via San Salvatore al Monte. The steps themselves are probably about 6 feet deep and about, I would say about 12 feet wide. So you feel as though you have suddenly shrunk. This is tough. You're taking about 2 or 3 steps to get up one of the stone steps here. The higher you go, climbing these steps which never seem to end, the better the view is of Florence across the way. In Purgatorio, Dante mentions these very steps. Dante is led by an angel in Purgatorio to a rock which had been cut out of the landscape, and the angel struck Dante's forehead with his wings, promising Dante a safe journey. And then Dante describes how arduous the climb is.
Me nocci ove la roccia era tagliata, quivi mi batté l'ali per la fronte, poi mi promise sicura l'andata. Come a man destra per salire al monte dove siede la chiesa che soggiorna. As on the right hand to go up the hill on which the church stands above the Rubaconte, dominating the well-guarded city. The climb up the jutting hill is broken by the stairs that were built there in an age when the records and the measures were kept safe. So the bank falling away steeply from the other circle is made easier. But the high rock presses from one side and the other.
Dante vanished in 1302. Of course, never set foot inside Florence again, not once. You can't help but think that for the better part of 2 decades, shunting around Italy, going from place to place, the energies of his mind got sort of split into 2. His mind would naturally go forward, imagining his own future, but beyond the temporal boundaries of his own life, into the real future, the life ahead of his life, which is, of course, Purgatorio, and back into his own past, into his own experiences, such as this series of steps leading up to the church of San Miniato.
Dante was born in an impoverished, low nobility family, Florentine family. His father was really a man that I believe, I don't have much evidence to go by direct evidence, but I believe Dante was somewhat embarrassed by his own father. He appears, he's an object of scorn in poems written in satirical poems written by some of Dante's polemical poet friends. And in order to get to Dante, they make references to Dante's own immediate father as being a usurer, parasite, a swindler of sorts. And I think that this consciousness was the fundamental impulse in Dante's singular mixture of pride and humility. Dante had a double perception of his context. On the one hand, a sense of the extraordinary achievements of the past, the members of the ancestors, and on the other hand, the clear awareness that his own father was the endpoint of a parabola of what one might call family decadence. And I think that both would find their rationale in this family background.
Oh, and here we are at the summit. Ah, and there's the Church of San Miniato.
Poet Dante Alighieri to poet Forese Donati, using Donati's nickname of Bici.
Young Bici, you've stuffed so much down your gorge that you're reduced to stealing from others. And already people who carry purses keep clear of him who draws near, saying, Scarface there is obviously a known thief.
Dante started it with this sonnet, lampooning his friend's apparent gluttony and thievery. But Forese Donati was quick to fire back a sonnet of his own, implicating Dante in his father's shady reputation as a moneylender.
I know you're Alighieri's son, all right. I can tell that by the fine, clean vengeance you took on his behalf for the money he exchanged the other day. You needn't have been in such a hurry to make peace. But then, you'd filled your sack so full that 2 pack horses couldn't carry it.
You'd hardly recognize the elegant poet of love in this exchange. Dante is accused by Forese of cowardice and of being so scared that he defecated in his trousers, to the point where 2 horses couldn't carry him. And the fun doesn't stop there. Dante scholar Amilcare Iannucci.
In the 1290s, there is this tensone, or this exchange of sonnets between Forese and Dante. These poems are very offensive, and the language is often obscene. There are a series of scurrilous verse. Forese, for instance, accuses Dante of cowardice. There's a reference to his not having vindicated some sort of slight that was made against his father. His father was apparently accused of some sort of crime. And Dante accuses Forese of abandoning his wife Nella, whom he refers to as being badly covered, that is, mal coperta.
Anyone who heard the coughing of the luckless wife of Bici, called Forese, might say that maybe she'd pass the winter in the land where crystal is made. You'll find her frozen in mid-August. So guess how she must fare in any other month.
And that's because Forese is chasing the prostitutes of Florence.
Meaning that Forese's wife was left alone and cold in the marital bed. The exchange between Dante and Forese was a game, a slang-filled sparring match between 2 young friends. But by the time Dante was writing the Purgatorio, he'd outgrown the need for gutter language. Forese died not long after their poetic exchange. So guess whom Dante and Virgil meet climbing the mountain of Purgatory on the terrace of the gluttonous, expiating his sin in the most visible of ways.
A crowd of souls, silent and devout, came and stared at us in wonder as they passed by. Each was dark and hollow about the eyes. Their faces were pallid, and they were shrunken so that the bones were showing through the skin. And there, from deep in the hollow of his head, a shade turned his eyes on me, and kept them on me. Forese, from that day when you exchanged the world for a better life, to this, 5 years have not turned all the way. How is it that you have come up so soon? I had thought I would find you lower down there.
there is this recognition scene, but it's very difficult to recognize Forese because he's skin and bones. His features sort of stick out, and the recognition is really on the part of Forese towards Dante, and then as soon as Forese starts to speak, there is an engagement between the two. And what do they talk about? They talk about the old days together. Forese, of course, is so far up in purgatory because Nella, his widow, has prayed for him. And because she is obviously in the grace of God, her prayers have been effective. And so he is much further in purgatory than he deserves to be without her. So there is a kind of dichotomy between the way we were and the way we are now. I think Dante, the poet, at that point is really making amends for this episode in his past.
The whole purpose of the Mountain of Purgatory is, after all, to make amends for the past. But Dante is really dealing only with a certain kind of poetry he wrote in his past, where the bigger the insult, the bigger the lie, the greater the effect. If his journey up the mountain and into paradise is to be successful, he has to make poetry truthful and a way of approaching the divine. And that means he has to confront an old conception of poetry, one that had the endorsement of no less a philosopher than St. Thomas Aquinas, and stretched back to the great thinkers of antiquity. Dante scholar Robert Hollander.
The traditional defense of poetry goes back a long way, probably to Plato, in which poets see themselves as telling what are in fact lies, but which can be analyzed in ways that render their truth. So that poets accede to the notion that their attackers always use against them, that they're nothing but liars. In Dante's view, or in my view of Dante's view, poets stupidly give in to that charge and say, yes, of course we lie, but in our lies are hidden truths. St. Thomas is about the greatest near-current mind that Dante knows. Thomas specifically says at one point that poets are liars, and that poetry has a minimum of scientia, is the term he uses, science, or the possibility of creating knowledge. Well, you wouldn't turn to something that can give you the least amount of truth. You'd turn to something that can give you the most. So you would learn what you need to learn, so you finally come to theology, and that contains the most of truth. Dante's way of solving it was to say Thomas is right. And therefore, if I want to be a poet, I have to be a different kind of poet, a poet who tells nothing but the truth, including literal truth. This poem presents itself as though it actually had occurred, over and over again, bending your arm until you say, okay, it really happened. And he goes out of his way to insist upon this absolutely unbelievable fact.
Giuseppe Mazzotta.
What he understood is that poetry is unlike all the other forms of expression, unlike dialectic, unlike science, unlike physics, unlike anything else. But all the other forms of discourse have a kind of linear and a kind of persuasive aim. They belong, we would say, to the rhetorical domain of discourse. Poetry makes us see the world as a whole, so that poetry has the power to transcend linear, partial, and separate modes of perceptions. It is a unique language because it is the language of beauty and the language of play, and forces on us a contemplative way of seeing. So Dante is the figure who truly understood from the start the power of beauty and the power of poetry as ways of leading us to the vision of God.
What emerges now in Dante's imagination is a rare blend of poetry and beauty leading to God. Remember that Dante was a love poet in his youth, and it all began in a meeting with a girl that transformed his life. On the 1st of May, 1274, when everyone in his neighborhood in Florence was celebrating the arrival of spring, he left his house, passed the little church of Santa Margherita, and headed for the Palazzo of Folco Portinari, where a celebration was underway. He was just a boy, but he was smitten by her beauty.
She was the daughter of an extraordinarily rich man, Folco Portinari, and he was famous. He was not only a well-to-do man, he was also a remarkable philanthropist. He actually left a lot of money to establish a hospital that would take care of the poor. So that was one of the